On May 30th, 1593, in a small room in Deptford, England's greatest living playwright was killed by a dagger driven through his eye and into his brain. He was 29 years old. The official story was a quarrel over the dinner bill, but the three men present were all government spies, directly connected to the Queen's own intelligence network, and Marlowe himself had been summoned before the Privy Council just days before, accused of heresy, a charge that in 1593 meant death. He was buried the next morning in an unmarked grave, as if someone needed him gone and forgotten quickly. Christopher Marlowe, the shoemaker's son who outshone every writer of his generation, who put the devil on stage and made audiences love him, who served the Crown's darkest secrets while writing the plays that taught Shakespeare how to write, died at 29 in a room full of liars. And the question that has haunted 4 centuries was never how he died. It was who needed him silenced. In the year 1564, in the ancient English city of Canterbury, a child was born who would change the course of literature forever. His name was Christopher Marlowe. He would grow up to become the most dangerous writer of the Elizabethan age. A poet, a playwright, a spy, and a heretic. He would invent the language of English drama, create characters so powerful they still haunt the stage 4 centuries later, and die violently at the age of 29 under circumstances so mysterious that scholars are still arguing about them today. But before any of that, he was just a boy, the son of a shoemaker, a child of Canterbury. Canterbury in the 1560s was a city defined by 2 forces, God and commerce. It was the spiritual heart of England, home to the great Canterbury Cathedral, the seat of the Archbishop, and the destination of pilgrims who had been walking its cobblestone streets for 400 years, ever since the murder of Thomas Becket in 1170. But Canterbury was also a bustling, noisy, overcrowded market town, a place where tanners, butchers, brewers, and cobblers jostled for space within the ancient Roman walls. The streets smelled of leather, animal fat, and ale. The sound of church bells competed with the clatter of horse hooves and the shouts of merchants hawking their wares. It was into this world that Christopher Marlowe was born, likely in late February 1564. He was baptized at St. George's Church on February 26th. His father, John Marlowe, was a shoemaker, or, as the Elizabethans called it, a cobbler, who had migrated to Canterbury from the nearby village of Osprings, close to Faversham. John Marlowe was a man of modest means but considerable ambition. He had earned the status of a freeman of Canterbury, which gave him the right to trade within the city walls, and he ran his shop on St. George's Lane, in the shadow of the great cathedral. Christopher's mother was Catherine Arthur, a woman from Dover, about whom almost nothing is known beyond her name and her extraordinary fertility. She and John would have 9 children in total, though only 5 would survive to adulthood. Christopher was the second child, but he became the eldest, surviving after his older sister Mary died in 1568. Death was a constant companion in Elizabethan England. Plague, smallpox, and simple infections carried off children with terrifying regularity. To survive childhood at all was, in some ways, an achievement. The Canterbury of Marlowe's youth was also a city in the grip of religious upheaval. England had been torn apart by the Reformation, the violent break from the Catholic Church initiated by Henry VIII just 3 decades earlier. By the time Christopher was born, England was officially Protestant under the young Queen Elizabeth I. But the scars of the religious wars ran deep. Canterbury, as the seat of the Anglican Church, was at the epicenter of this conflict. Catholic sympathizers were hunted, imprisoned, and executed. Protestant refugees from the wars raging across France and the Netherlands flooded into the city, bringing with them foreign languages, foreign customs, and a palpable sense of fear. This was the atmosphere in which young Christopher grew up, a world where faith was a matter of life and death, where the wrong prayer could get you killed, and where the boundaries between loyalty and treason were terrifyingly thin. These themes, power, faith, betrayal, and the terrible cost of defiance, would come to define every single work he ever wrote. We know almost nothing about Marlowe's earliest years. There are no surviving letters, no childhood anecdotes, no diary entries from doting parents. What we do know is that the boy was brilliant. In an age when most children of tradesmen received little or no formal education, Christopher Marlowe's intellectual gifts were recognized early. At the age of 14, in late 1578 or early 1579, he was awarded a scholarship to the King's School, Canterbury. The King's School was no ordinary institution. It was one of the oldest and most prestigious schools in England, attached directly to Canterbury Cathedral. Founded in 597 AD, it had been educating the sons of the English elite for nearly 1,000 years by the time Marlowe walked through its doors. The scholarship was a transformative stroke of fortune for the cobbler's son. It meant free tuition, free board, and access to an education that was normally reserved for the children of gentlemen and clergy. At the King's School, Marlowe was immersed in the rigorous classical curriculum of the Elizabethan grammar school. He studied Latin grammar, rhetoric, and logic. He read the great Roman authors, Cicero, Virgil, Horace, and most importantly for his future career, he discovered the poetry of Ovid. Ovid's Amores, a collection of sensual, witty, and often scandalous love elegies, captivated the young Marlowe. He would later produce one of the first English translations of the Amores, a translation so frank and sexually explicit that copies were publicly burned by order of the Archbishop of Canterbury in 1599. But that was years away. For now the teenage boy was simply devouring the words of the ancient Roman poet, absorbing the rhythms of Latin verse and discovering the intoxicating power of language. The King's School also exposed Marlowe to the world of performance. The school regularly staged plays, both in Latin and in English, as part of its educational program. Students were expected to act, to declaim, and to understand the mechanics of dramatic storytelling. For a boy with Marlowe's gifts, this was an electrifying experience. The stage was a place where words became flesh, where ideas could be tested, and where the boundaries of the acceptable could be pushed in ways that were impossible in the pulpit or the marketplace. But the King's School scholarship was not merely a gift. It came with expectations. The scholarships at the King's School, and the even more prestigious scholarships that followed at Cambridge, were funded by the Church with the explicit understanding that the recipients would enter the Anglican clergy. Christopher Marlowe, the cobbler's son, was being groomed to become a priest. It is one of the great ironies of literary history. The boy who would grow up to write the most blasphemous, heretical, and theologically provocative plays of the Elizabethan age was educated from the very beginning by the Church. The institution that would one day seek to silence him was the very institution that gave him his voice. By 1580, Marlowe had completed his time at the King's School. He was 16 years old, fluent in Latin, steeped in classical literature, and burning with an intellectual ambition that the narrow streets of Canterbury could no longer contain. The next step was Cambridge, the great university, the gateway to power, influence, and a life far removed from his father's cobbler's shop. A scholarship was waiting for him at Corpus Christi College, one of the oldest and most distinguished colleges in the university. But Cambridge would prove to be far more than an education. It would be the place where Christopher Marlowe was recruited into the most dangerous game in Elizabethan England, the shadow world of espionage. The cobbler's son was about to become a spy for the Queen. In late 1580, a 16-year-old Christopher Marlowe arrived in Cambridge. He had traded the narrow, bustling streets of Canterbury for the sweeping Gothic architecture and cloistered quadrangles of one of Europe's greatest centres of learning. He was enrolled at Corpus Christi College, holding a scholarship established by Matthew Parker, the former Archbishop of Canterbury. The terms of the Parker Scholarship were strict. The recipient was expected to study diligently, master the classics, and ultimately take holy orders to become a priest in the Church of England. For the first few years, Marlowe appeared to be doing exactly that. Cambridge in the 1580s was a place of intense intellectual ferment. It was a world of theological debate, philosophical inquiry, and rigorous academic discipline. Students were required to speak Latin at all times, even during meals. They studied logic, rhetoric, philosophy, and theology. For a young man with Marlowe's voracious appetite for knowledge, it was a paradise. He devoured the works of the ancients, not just the required texts, but the subversive ones as well. He read Ovid, whose sensual poetry he had already begun to translate. He read Lucan, whose epic poem Pharsalia detailed the bloody civil war that destroyed the Roman Republic, a text that Marlowe would also translate, drawn to its dark anti-authoritarian themes. In 1584, Marlowe successfully completed his Bachelor of Arts degree. He was 20 years old, and he was on track to fulfill the expectations of his scholarship. The next step was a Master of Arts degree, which would require 3 more years of study, culminating in his ordination as a clergyman. But it was during these 3 years, between 1584 and 1587, that the trajectory of Christopher Marlowe's life took a sharp, dangerous, and irreversible turn. The first clue that something was amiss can be found in the surviving records of Corpus Christi College. The university kept meticulous attendance logs, and beginning in the academic year of 1584 to 1585, Marlowe's name began to disappear from them for weeks, and sometimes months, at a time. These were not the normal absences of a student visiting home for the holidays. They were prolonged, unexplained disappearances that violated university regulations. Even more suspicious were the college buttery accounts, the records of what students spent on food and drink. When Marlowe was actually present in Cambridge during this period, his spending habits changed dramatically. The cobbler's son, who was living on a modest scholarship stipend, suddenly began spending lavishly. He was buying expensive meats, fine wines, and quantities of food that far exceeded his known income. Where was he going during his long absences? And more importantly, where was the money coming from? The answer lies in the dark, paranoid political climate of Elizabethan England. In the 1580s, Queen Elizabeth I was facing an existential threat. The Catholic powers of Europe, led by King Philip II of Spain, were determined to overthrow the Protestant Queen and restore England to the Catholic faith. The Pope had excommunicated Elizabeth and declared that assassinating her would not be a sin. Catholic priests, trained at English seminaries on the continent, most notably in the French city of Rheims, were being smuggled into England to minister to secret Catholics, and, the government feared, to foment rebellion. To combat this invisible enemy, Elizabeth's principal secretary, Sir Francis Walsingham, had constructed a vast, sophisticated intelligence network. Walsingham was the Queen's spymaster. He employed a small army of agents, informers, cryptographers, and provocateurs to infiltrate Catholic networks, intercept correspondence, and root out treason. And Walsingham needed a very specific type of recruit: young, highly educated, fluent in foreign languages, and capable of blending in with the intellectual elite. He needed men who could debate theology with a Catholic priest one day and betray him to the executioner the next. He needed men exactly like Christopher Marlowe. While there is no single document that explicitly states Christopher Marlowe is a spy, the circumstantial evidence is overwhelming. Cambridge was a known recruiting ground for Walsingham's secret service. The spymaster himself had connections to the university, and several of Marlowe's contemporaries at Cambridge were known to have worked for the intelligence network. It is almost certain that during his long absences from Corpus Christi, Marlowe was working as a courier, an informer, or an agent provocateur for the government. The nature of his missions remains a mystery. He may have travelled to the continent, perhaps even infiltrating the English Catholic seminary at Reims. He may have been spying on his fellow students at Cambridge, reporting on those who harboured Catholic sympathies. Whatever he was doing, it was dangerous, it was highly secretive, and it paid very well. But living a double life takes a toll. The young man who was studying to be a priest was now immersed in a world of deception, betrayal, and state-sponsored violence. He was learning that power was not derived from God, but from information, manipulation, and ruthlessness. These lessons would bleed directly into his writing. When Marlowe later created characters like the Machiavellian Barabbas in The Jew of Malta, or the power-hungry conqueror in Tamburlaine, he was not writing from abstract theory. He was writing from what he had seen in the shadows of Elizabeth's court. By the spring of 1587, Marlowe's double life finally caught up with him. He was due to receive his Master of Arts degree, but the university authorities balked. A vicious rumour had swept through Cambridge. Christopher Marlowe, the Parker scholar, was planning to defect. The rumour claimed that he intended to travel to Reims, abandon his Protestant faith, and be ordained as a Catholic priest. In Elizabethan England, this was not merely an academic scandal. It was a capital crime. In 1585, the Queen had issued an edict making it high treason for any English subject to be ordained as a Catholic priest. If the university authorities believed the rumour, Marlowe was not just risking his degree, he was risking the gallows. The university threatened to withhold his Master of Arts. Marlowe's academic career, and possibly his life, hung in the balance. But then, something extraordinary happened. On June 29, 1587, a letter arrived at Cambridge. It was not from a local bishop or a university official. It was from the Privy Council, the highest governing body in the land, the inner circle of the Queen's most trusted advisers, including the Lord Treasurer, Lord Burghley, and the Archbishop of Canterbury. The letter, the contents of which were recorded in the Privy Council minutes, was a direct intervention on Marlowe's behalf. It addressed the rumours of his defection to Reims and flatly denied them. But it went much further than that. The council declared that Marlowe had been engaged in matters touching the benefit of his country. They stated that he had behaved himself orderly and discreetly, and that he had done Her Majesty good service. The letter concluded with a stern rebuke to the university, because it was not Her Majesty's pleasure that anyone employed, as he had been in matters touching the benefit of his country, should be defamed by those who are ignorant in the affairs he went about. The council ordered that Marlowe be granted his degree at the next commencement. It was a stunning display of state power. The Privy Council had effectively pulled back the curtain just an inch to protect one of their own. The vague, coded language, matters touching the benefit of his country, the affairs he went about, was the standard bureaucratic terminology used to describe espionage. The government was acknowledging that the rumours of Marlowe going to Reims were likely a cover story, a necessary fiction for whatever mission he had been undertaking. The university authorities had no choice but to comply. In July 1587, Christopher Marlowe was awarded his Master of Arts degree. He had survived. He had the protection of the most powerful men in England. But his time at Cambridge was over. The church was no longer an option. A man known to be associated with Walsingham's secret service could hardly settle down as a quiet country parson. Marlowe packed his bags and left Cambridge for London. He was 23 years old. He had a head full of classical poetry, a heart full of dangerous secrets, and a pen that was about to set the English stage on fire. The scholar and the spy was about to become a playwright. When Christopher Marlowe arrived in London in the summer of 1587, the city was a powder keg. The threat of a Spanish invasion loomed over the capital. The plague was a constant, terrifying presence, and the streets were teeming with a volatile mix of courtiers, merchants, refugees, and criminals. But London was also the centre of a cultural explosion. The first purpose-built commercial playhouses, the theatre and the curtain, had recently opened in the lawless suburbs just outside the city walls, beyond the jurisdiction of the puritanical city authorities. The Elizabethan theatre industry was in its infancy, hungry for new material, new spectacles, and new voices. Marlowe, armed with his freshly minted Master of Arts degree and his shadowy connections to the Secret Service, stepped into this chaotic world and immediately set it on fire. Before Marlowe, English drama was largely a crude, clunky affair. Plays were typically written in rhyming couplets, a rigid, sing-song metre that often sounded childish and artificial. The subject matter was usually moralistic, featuring allegorical characters like vice and virtue, battling for the soul of mankind. It was theatre designed to instruct, not to thrill. Marlowe changed all of that with a single play, Tamburlaine the Great. Written around 1587, Tamburlaine was a theatrical earthquake. It told the story of Timur the Lame, a 14th-century Central Asian shepherd who rose from obscurity to become one of the most ruthless and powerful conquerors in history. But it wasn't just the subject matter that shocked audiences. It was the language. Marlowe discarded the traditional rhyming couplets and wrote the play in unrhymed iambic pentameter, what we now call blank verse. Blank verse mimics the natural rhythm of English speech, but elevates it, giving it a muscular, driving momentum. In Marlowe's hands, it became a weapon. His contemporary, the playwright Ben Jonson, would later famously dub it Marlowe's mighty line. It was loud, it was aggressive, and it was utterly mesmerizing. When the title character steps onto the stage, he does not speak like a humble shepherd. He speaks like a god in waiting. He declares his ambition with a terrifying, intoxicating arrogance. Is it not passing brave to be a king and ride in triumph through Persepolis? The impact of Tamburlaine on the London theatre scene cannot be overstated. It was a massive, unprecedented blockbuster. Audiences had never seen anything like it. Here was a protagonist who defied God, slaughtered his enemies without mercy, conquered the known world and, crucially, was never punished for it. In traditional Elizabethan morality plays, a character as wicked and arrogant as Tamburlaine would have been struck down by divine retribution in the final act. But Marlowe's Tamburlaine simply keeps winning. He uses captured kings as footstools, harnesses emperors to his chariot like horses, and burns entire cities to the ground, all while speaking some of the most beautiful, soaring poetry ever written in the English language. Nature, that framed us of four elements warring within our breasts for regiment, doth teach us all to have aspiring minds. The success of the play was due in no small part to the man who brought Tamburlaine to life on stage, Edward Alleyn. Alleyn was the lead actor of the Admiral's Men, the premier acting company of the day. He was a giant of a man, physically imposing, with a booming voice capable of filling the open-air amphitheatres. The partnership between Marlowe and Alleyn was the first great writer-actor collaboration in English theatre history. Marlowe wrote the massive, towering roles, and Alleyn possessed the sheer physical and vocal power to execute them. Together, they created the archetype of the Elizabethan anti-hero. The success of the play was due in no small part to the man who brought Tamburlaine to life on stage, Edward Alleyn. Alleyn was the lead actor of the Admiral's Men, the premier acting company of the day. He was a giant of a man, physically imposing, with a booming voice capable of filling the open-air amphitheatres. The partnership between Marlowe and Alleyn was the first great writer-actor collaboration in English theatre history. Marlowe wrote the massive, towering roles, and Alleyn possessed the sheer physical and vocal power to execute them. Together, they created the archetype of the Elizabethan anti-hero. The demand for Tamburlaine was so intense that Marlowe immediately wrote a sequel, Tamburlaine, Part 2, which was staged later that same year or early in 1588. The sequel was even more violent and transgressive than the first. In one of the most shocking scenes in Elizabethan drama, Tamburlaine burns a copy of the Quran on stage, daring the Islamic god, or any god, to strike him down. When no lightning bolt falls from the sky, Tamburlaine concludes that he himself is the only divine force that matters. For an audience living in a deeply religious, highly censored society, watching a character openly defy the heavens and get away with it was a profoundly subversive experience. It was thrilling, it was terrifying, and it was dangerously close to heresy. But Marlowe was not just writing violent spectacles, he was exploring the psychology of power. Tamburlaine is a play about the intoxicating, corrupting nature of absolute ambition. It asks a deeply uncomfortable question. What happens when a human being decides that the rules of morality, religion, and human decency simply do not apply to them? It was a question that Marlowe, having spent time in the cynical Machiavellian world of Walsingham's Secret Service, was uniquely equipped to ask. While Tamburlaine made Marlowe the undisputed king of the London stage, it was not his only work from this early period. Around the same time, or perhaps slightly earlier, he wrote Dido, Queen of Carthage. Co-authored with his friend and fellow playwright Thomas Nash, Dido was a very different kind of play. It was written not for the adult actors of the commercial playhouses, but for the children of the chapel, a company of highly trained boy actors who performed for elite, aristocratic audiences. Based on the first half of Virgil's Aeneid, Dido tells the tragic story of the Carthaginian queen who falls desperately in love with the Trojan hero Aeneas, only to be abandoned by him when the gods order him to leave and found the city of Rome. While it lacks the sheer explosive violence of Tamburlaine, Dido showcases Marlowe's extraordinary lyrical gift and his deep engagement with classical literature. Interestingly, Dido also features one of the earliest examples of Marlowe's willingness to explore transgressive sexuality on stage. The play opens with a scene that has absolutely nothing to do with the main plot. The supreme god Jupiter is shown dallying with his beautiful young male cupbearer, Ganymede. It is a moment of blatant homoeroticism presented without apology or moral condemnation. It was a bold choice, and a clear signal that Christopher Marlowe had no intention of playing by the rules of conventional Elizabethan morality. By the end of 1588, at the age of 24, Christopher Marlowe was the most famous, the most successful, and the most controversial writer in England. He had single-handedly revolutionized the English theatre, transforming it from a medium of moral instruction into a vehicle for spectacular, dangerous art. He had given the stage its first great anti-hero, and he had given the English language its mighty line. But the fame and the money did not bring him peace. The restless, questioning intellect that had driven him from the cobbler's shop in Canterbury to the heights of the London literary world was still burning. He was still moving in the dangerous circles of the Secret Service, still associating with spies, freethinkers, and radicals. He had conquered the stage, but he was about to push his art and his life into even darker, more perilous territory. By 1589, Christopher Marlowe was the undisputed master of the London stage. The massive success of Tamburlaine had proven that audiences were hungry for complex, morally ambiguous protagonists who defied the established order. Marlowe, ever the provocateur, was more than happy to oblige. Over the next 2 years, he would write 2 plays that would cement his reputation as the most dangerous mind in English literature: The Jew of Malta and The Tragical History of Doctor Faustus. Both plays explored the darkest corners of human ambition, and both featured characters who were willing to sacrifice their souls for power, wealth, and knowledge. The Jew of Malta, written around 1589 or 1590, is a masterpiece of dark, cynical comedy. The play centers on Barabbas, a wealthy Jewish merchant living on the island of Malta. When the Christian governor of Malta arbitrarily confiscates Barabbas's entire fortune to pay off a tribute to the Ottoman Turks, Barabbas embarks on a spectacular, blood-soaked campaign of revenge. He poisons an entire convent of nuns, including his own daughter, orchestrates the deaths of his enemies, and eventually betrays the entire island to the Turks, only to betray the Turks back to the Christians. On the surface, Barabbas appears to be a crude anti-Semitic stereotype, a villain designed to appeal to the prejudices of an Elizabethan audience. But in Marlowe's hands, the character becomes something far more subversive. Barabbas is undoubtedly wicked, but he is also the smartest, most articulate and most honest character in the play. He openly mocks the hypocrisy of the Christian rulers who steal his money in the name of God. In one of the play's most famous and dangerous lines, Barabbas declares, "I count religion but a childish toy, and hold, there is no sin but ignorance." In The Jew of Malta, Marlowe presents a world where religion is nothing more than a cynical tool used by the powerful to justify their greed and violence. Christians, Jews, and Muslims are all depicted as equally corrupt, equally ruthless, and equally driven by the pursuit of infinite riches in a little room. It is a bleak Machiavellian vision of society, one that almost certainly reflected Marlowe's own experiences working within the shadowy, morally compromised world of Elizabethan espionage. If The Jew of Malta was a cynical critique of religious hypocrisy, Marlowe's next play was a terrifying plunge into the abyss of spiritual despair. The tragical history of Dr. Faustus, likely written between 1588 and 1592, is arguably Marlowe's greatest achievement. It is the first dramatized version of the German Faust legend, the story of a brilliant scholar who makes a pact with the devil, exchanging his soul for 24 years of absolute power and forbidden knowledge. Faustus is the ultimate Renaissance man. He has mastered every field of human study: logic, medicine, law, and theology. But he finds them all lacking. He is bored by the limitations of human knowledge and yearns for the power of a god. To achieve this, he turns to necromancy, summoning the demon Mephistopheles and signing a contract with Lucifer in his own blood. What makes Dr. Faustus so compelling is not the magic or the spectacle, but the profound psychological realism of the characters. Mephistopheles is not a cackling, cartoonish fiend. He is a tragic, melancholic figure, a fallen angel who is acutely aware of what he has lost. When Faustus asks him how he managed to escape from hell to appear on earth, Mephistopheles delivers one of the most chilling and profound theological statements in all of literature. "Why, this is hell, nor am I out of it. Think'st thou that I, who saw the face of God, and tasted the eternal joys of heaven, am not tormented with 10,000 hells in being deprived of everlasting bliss?" For Mephistopheles, hell is not a physical place of fire and brimstone. It is a state of mind, the eternal agonizing absence of God. "All places shall be hell that are not heaven," he warns. But Faustus, blinded by his own arrogance, refuses to listen. He uses his demonic power not to unlock the secrets of the universe, but to perform cheap parlor tricks, playing practical jokes on the Pope, conjuring grapes out of season and summoning the spirit of Helen of Troy, the most beautiful woman in myth. As he embraces the phantom of Helen, Faustus speaks lines of such transcendent beauty that they have become immortal. Was this the face that launched 1,000 ships and burnt the topless towers of Ilium? Sweet Helen, make me immortal with a kiss. But the kiss brings no immortality, only the sealing of his doom. The final scene of the play, as the clock ticks down to midnight and the demons come to collect his soul, is a masterpiece of sustained, agonizing terror. Faustus begs for salvation, screaming, "Oh, I'll leap up to my God! Who pulls me down? See where Christ's blood streams in the firmament." But it is too late. He is dragged off to hell, leaving behind only his mangled remains and a chilling warning to the audience about the dangers of overreaching ambition. While Marlowe was exploring the depths of human depravity on the stage, his own life was spiralling into violence on the streets of London. The playwright was not merely an observer of the criminal underworld, he was an active participant. On the afternoon of September 18th, 1589, Marlowe was walking through Norton Folgate, a notoriously rough neighbourhood just north of the city walls. He became involved in a violent altercation with a man named William Bradley. The exact cause of the fight is unknown, but swords were drawn. As the two men duelled in the street, Marlowe's friend, the poet and playwright Thomas Watson, happened upon the scene. Watson drew his own sword and intervened, shouting, "Art thou now come? Then I will have a bout with thee." Bradley turned his attention to Watson, and the fight escalated. Bradley was severely wounded and died in the street. Both Marlowe and Watson were immediately arrested by the local constable and taken to Newgate Prison, one of the most horrific and disease-ridden dungeons in London. Newgate was a place where prisoners routinely died of jail fever, typhus, before they ever saw a judge. Marlowe, the celebrated playwright, found himself locked in a dark, stinking cell alongside murderers, thieves, and political dissidents. He remained in Newgate for nearly 2 weeks before he was finally granted bail on October 1st. When the case went to trial in December, the jury ruled that Thomas Watson had killed William Bradley in self-defense, and both men were acquitted. Marlowe walked free, but the incident left a dark stain on his reputation. It confirmed the growing rumours that the brilliant poet was also a dangerous, volatile brawler. The Norton Folgate fight was a stark reminder that the violence in Marlowe's plays was not merely a theatrical device. It was a reflection of the brutal reality of Elizabethan London and of Marlowe's own turbulent nature. He was a man who lived on the edge, constantly pushing boundaries, both in his art and in his life. He had survived Newgate, just as he had survived the rumours of treason at Cambridge. But his luck would not hold forever. The shadows were beginning to close in, and the final, fatal act of Christopher Marlowe's life was about to begin. As the 1590s dawned, Christopher Marlowe was operating at the absolute peak of his creative powers. He had already revolutionized the English stage with Tamburlaine, the Jew of Malta, and Doctor Faustus, but his ambition was far from exhausted. During this period, he turned his attention to new forms of writing, producing some of the most exquisite poetry of the Elizabethan era, while simultaneously writing a play that would push the boundaries of political and sexual representation further than anyone had ever dared. But even as his literary star continued to rise, his secret life as a government agent was beginning to unravel, drawing him into a dangerous web of counterfeiting, espionage, and accusations of atheism. Marlowe's poetic output during these years reveals a very different side of the playwright. Away from the blood and thunder of the public playhouses, he wrote verse of astonishing delicacy and sensual beauty. His most famous poem, The Passionate Shepherd to His Love, became an instant sensation, circulating in manuscript form long before it was officially published. It is a masterpiece of pastoral lyricism, an idealized vision of rural romance that begins with one of the most famous opening lines in English literature. "Come live with me and be my love, and we will all the pleasures prove, that valleys, groves, hills and fields, woods or steepy mountain yields." The poem was so popular that it inspired numerous responses and parodies from other writers, most notably Sir Walter Raleigh's cynical "The Nymph's Reply to the Shepherd." But Marlowe's greatest poetic achievement was his narrative poem Hero and Leander. Based on an ancient Greek myth, it tells the story of two doomed lovers separated by the Hellespont. Marlowe's version is a riot of lush, erotic imagery, characterized by a playful, almost subversive approach to gender and sexuality. In Hero and Leander, Marlowe describes the physical beauty of the male youth, Leander, with a level of detail and adoration that was highly unusual for the time. He writes, "In his looks were all that men desire," and describes the sea god Neptune becoming so enamored with the boy that he attempts to seduce him beneath the waves. The poem also contains a line that would later be famously quoted by William Shakespeare in As You Like It. "Whoever loved that loved not at first sight." Marlowe never finished Hero and Leander. It was completed after his death by George Chapman. But the surviving fragment stands as one of the greatest erotic poems in the English language. This exploration of transgressive sexuality was not confined to his poetry. Around 1592, Marlowe wrote Edward II, a play that is widely considered to be his most mature and structurally perfect drama. It is also one of the most daring. Edward II tells the story of the 14th century English king whose reign was destroyed by his obsessive, all-consuming love for his male favourite, Piers Gaveston. In Elizabethan England, homosexuality was a capital offence, punishable by death. Yet Marlowe placed a same-sex love affair at the very centre of a major historical tragedy. He did not present Edward and Gaveston as villains or caricatures. He presented them as deeply flawed, intensely human characters whose love for each other is both genuine and politically disastrous. When the king's nobles demand to know why he dotes on Gaveston, Edward's defender, Mortimer, replies with a speech that elevates their relationship to the level of classical myth. "The mightiest kings have had their minions. Great Alexander loved Hephaestion, the conquering Hercules for Hylas wept, and for Patroclus stern Achilles drooped." Edward II is a brutal, unflinching examination of power, sexuality, and the horrific consequences of political instability. The play ends with the king's gruesome murder, a scene of such visceral horror that it remains shocking to modern audiences. With Edward II, Marlowe proved that he was not just a writer of spectacular set pieces, but a dramatist capable of profound psychological insight and political critique. But while Marlowe was writing about the downfall of kings, his own life was becoming increasingly precarious. His involvement with the Elizabethan Secret Service had not ended when he left Cambridge. In early 1592, Marlowe was arrested in the English garrison town of Flushing, Vlissingen, in the Netherlands. The charge was not brawling or heresy, but something far more dangerous: counterfeiting coins. Counterfeiting was considered a form of high treason, as it undermined the economic stability of the state. Marlowe was arrested alongside a goldsmith named Richard Baines, a man who would soon play a devastating role in Marlowe's downfall. According to the governor of Flushing, Marlowe and Baines had been caught trying to forge a Dutch shilling. When interrogated, the two men immediately turned on each other. Baines accused Marlowe of instigating the plot, while Marlowe claimed he was merely observing Baines's techniques out of curiosity. More alarmingly, the governor reported that Marlowe had boasted of his intention to defect to the Catholic enemy, claiming he had intent to go to the enemy or to Rome. This echoed the very same rumours that had nearly cost him his degree at Cambridge 5 years earlier. Marlowe was deported back to England in disgrace and handed over to the Lord Treasurer, Lord Burghley, to face charges of treason. But once again, the invisible hand of the state intervened. No charges were ever brought against him, and he was quietly released. Modern historians strongly suspect that the entire counterfeiting operation in Flushing was a botched espionage mission. Marlowe may have been attempting to infiltrate a network of Catholic counterfeiters, or perhaps trying to raise untraceable funds for Walsingham's intelligence operations. Whatever the truth, the incident proved that Marlowe was still deeply entangled in the lethal double-crossing world of Elizabethan spies. The Flushing arrest was a warning sign, but Marlowe did not slow down. Upon his return to London, he began associating with a group of radical intellectuals, scientists, and noblemen who would later be dubbed the School of Night. This informal circle, which allegedly included the explorer Sir Walter Raleigh, the mathematician Thomas Harriot, and the playwright George Chapman, was rumoured to meet in secret to discuss forbidden topics: astronomy, philosophy, and most dangerously, atheism. In the late 16th century, atheism was not merely a philosophical position. It was a direct threat to the authority of the state. To deny God was to deny the divine right of the Queen to rule. The authorities viewed atheism as the root of all treason. And Christopher Marlowe, with his razor-sharp intellect and his penchant for provocation, was rapidly gaining a reputation as the most vocal and dangerous atheist in London. Rumours began to circulate that Marlowe was openly mocking religion in taverns and private gatherings. He was said to have claimed that the Bible was a poorly written fiction, that religion was invented merely to keep men in awe, and that he could write a better religion himself. Whether these statements were genuine expressions of his beliefs or simply the drunken provocations of a man who loved to shock his audience, they were incredibly dangerous. Marlowe was playing with fire. He had survived the street fight in Norton Folgate, and he had survived the counterfeiting charge in Flushing, largely because he was useful to the state. But his usefulness was beginning to be outweighed by his notoriety. He was becoming a liability. The powerful men who had protected him were starting to view him as a threat. As the year 1592 drew to a close, the political climate in London was growing increasingly toxic. The plague had returned, forcing the theatres to close and plunging the city into fear and paranoia. The government was cracking down on dissent, hunting for heretics, traitors, and foreign agents. And Christopher Marlowe, the brilliant, arrogant, untouchable playwright, was walking directly into the crosshairs. The trap was being set, and the man who would spring it was the very man Marlowe had betrayed in Flushing, Richard Baines. The final act was about to begin. The spring of 1593 was a terrifying time to be alive in London. The city was suffocating under a devastating outbreak of the bubonic plague. The death toll was rising by the hundreds every week, forcing the authorities to close the public theatres to prevent the spread of the disease. The actors, including Edward Allen and the Admiral's men, packed up their costumes and fled to the countryside to tour the provinces. Christopher Marlowe, however, remained in the city, taking refuge in the homes of his wealthy patrons. But the plague was not the only contagion spreading through London. There was also a virulent outbreak of xenophobia and political paranoia. The city was flooded with Protestant refugees from France and the Netherlands, who had fled religious persecution on the continent. As the economic situation in London worsened, the local tradesmen and apprentices began to blame the immigrants for stealing their jobs and driving up prices. Tensions boiled over in early May 1593, when a series of vicious, xenophobic posters were nailed to the walls of the Dutch churchyard in Broad Street. These posters, known as the Dutch church libels, threatened the refugees with extreme violence if they did not leave the city. But what made the libels truly dangerous was their literary style. They were written in rhyming iambic pentameter, and they deliberately quoted lines from Christopher Marlowe's plays. One of the most inflammatory posters was even signed with a chilling pseudonym, Tamburlaine. The Privy Council, terrified that the libels would spark a massive, uncontrollable riot, reacted with brutal efficiency. On May 11th, they issued a warrant authorizing the authorities to arrest and interrogate anyone suspected of writing the posters, and explicitly granted permission to use torture to extract confessions. The hunt for the author of the Dutch church libels was on, and because of the literary allusions, the authorities immediately turned their attention to the playwrights. The first man to fall into their net was not Marlowe, but his former roommate and fellow dramatist, Thomas Kyd. Kyd was the author of The Spanish Tragedy, a massively popular revenge play that had helped establish the Elizabethan theatrical boom alongside Tamburlaine. On May 12th, Kyd was arrested and his lodgings were searched. The authorities did not find any evidence linking him to the xenophobic libels, but they found something far worse. A 3-page manuscript containing heretical, atheistic arguments denying the divinity of Jesus Christ. In Elizabethan England, possessing such a document was a capital offence. Kidd was dragged to the horrific Bridewell prison, where he was subjected to the rack. Under the agony of torture, Kidd broke. He desperately claimed that the heretical papers were not his. He told his interrogators that the documents belonged to Christopher Marlowe, and that they had been accidentally shuffled among his own papers 2 years earlier, when the two men had been sharing a room and writing together for a wealthy patron. Kidd did not stop there. Desperate to save his own life, he painted a damning portrait of his former friend. He described Marlowe as a blasphemous, disorderly man who held treasonous opinions. He claimed that Marlowe was an irreligious reprobate who was intemperate and of a cruel heart, and who routinely mocked the scriptures and the clergy. Kidd's confession under torture was exactly what the authorities needed, but it was not the only weapon they had against Marlowe. Around the same time, a document was delivered to the authorities that would seal the playwright's fate. It was written by Richard Baines, the very same man Marlowe had been arrested with for counterfeiting in Flushing the previous year. The document, which has gone down in history as the Baines Note, is one of the most extraordinary and shocking texts to survive from the Elizabethan era. It is a comprehensive, itemized list of Marlowe's alleged blasphemies, crimes, and heresies. According to Baines, Marlowe had claimed that the first beginning of religion was only to keep men in awe, and that Christ was a bastard and his mother dishonest. Baines accused Marlowe of mocking the sacraments, defending homosexuality, and claiming that all they that love not tobacco and boys were fools. He alleged that Marlowe had boasted of his right to coin money, and that he had claimed he could write a better religion than the one currently established in England. The note concluded with a chilling demand for execution. "I think all men in Christianity ought to endeavour that the mouth of so dangerous a member may be stopped." Whether the Baines Note was a genuine record of Marlowe's private conversations, a malicious fabrication by a bitter enemy, or a calculated piece of state propaganda designed to justify his elimination, the result was the same. The document was lethal. It painted a picture of a man who was not just a heretic, but a profound threat to the moral and political order of the state. Armed with Kidd's tortured confession and the devastating Baines Note, the Privy Council acted. On May 18, 1593, they issued a warrant for the arrest of Christopher Marlowe. The warrant noted that Marlowe was currently staying at the country estate of Thomas Walsingham in Scadbury, Kent. Thomas Walsingham was the younger cousin of the late spymaster Sir Francis Walsingham, and he was deeply involved in the intelligence network. He was also Marlowe's patron and close friend. The fact that Marlowe was taking refuge in the home of a prominent intelligence figure suggests that he may have been seeking protection from the gathering storm. But the reach of the Privy Council was absolute. On May 20th, Marlowe duly presented himself before the Privy Council at the Royal Court. Given the severity of the charges against him, charges that had sent other men straight to the torture chamber and the executioner's block, what happened next is baffling. Marlowe was not thrown into the Tower of London. He was not sent to the rack. Instead, the council simply ordered him to give his daily attendance on their lordships until he shall be licensed to the contrary. He was, essentially, released on his own recognizance, required only to check in with the authorities every day while they decided what to do with him. This extraordinary leniency has puzzled historians for centuries. Why would the state treat a notorious, accused atheist and traitor with such kid gloves? The most likely explanation is that Marlowe's deep connections to the Secret Service were still protecting him. He knew too much. He had worked for the government for years, carrying out their dirty work, and he likely possessed secrets that powerful men did not want revealed in a public trial. To put Christopher Marlowe on the rack was to risk him naming names, exposing the dark, hypocritical underbelly of the Elizabethan intelligence apparatus. But this protection was a double-edged sword. By releasing him, the Privy Council had left him exposed. He was a liability, a loose end in a highly volatile political situation. He was a man who knew the darkest secrets of the state, and who was currently facing the prospect of torture and execution. He was a cornered animal, and cornered animals are dangerous. On the morning of Wednesday, May 30th, 1593, Christopher Marlowe travelled to the village of Deptford, on the banks of the River Thames, just a few miles downriver from London. He was going to a meeting at a house owned by a widow named Eleanor Bull. He was going to meet 3 men, all of whom had deep, extensive ties to the Elizabethan Secret Service. It was a meeting from which he would never return. The final bloody reckoning was at hand. The morning of Wednesday, May 30th, 1593, broke over the River Thames. Christopher Marlowe, still under the daily surveillance of the Privy Council, travelled to the village of Deptford, in a bustling maritime community just a few miles downriver from the heart of London. He was not going there to write, nor was he going there to hide. He was going to a meeting. His destination was a house owned by a respectable widow named Eleanor Bull. For centuries, historians mistakenly referred to this establishment as a tavern or a bawdy house, painting a picture of a drunken tavern brawl. But Eleanor Bull was a woman of good standing with connections to the royal court. Her house was likely a private victualling house, a place where gentlemen could rent a room for the day, conduct business in private, and be served food and drink. It was the perfect location for a discreet, confidential meeting. Waiting for Marlowe at Eleanor Bull's house were 3 men. Their identities are the key to understanding the events of that fatal day, because none of them were ordinary citizens. They were all deeply embedded in the same shadowy, lethal world of Elizabethan espionage that Marlowe himself inhabited. The first man was Ingram Fraser. Fraser was a servant and business agent for Thomas Walsingham, Marlowe's patron, and the man whose estate Marlowe had been staying at when the arrest warrant was issued. Fraser was a ruthless businessman, a loan shark, and a property speculator who operated on the fringes of the law. The second man was Nicholas Skeers. Skeers was a known associate of Fraser, a con man, and a long-time agent for the government. He had been involved in the Babington plot of 1586, a Catholic conspiracy to assassinate Queen Elizabeth, which Sir Francis Walsingham had allowed to develop specifically so he could trap and execute Mary, Queen of Scots. Skeers had been one of Walsingham's agent provocateurs in that operation. The third man was the most dangerous of all, Robert Poley. Poley was a master spy, a veteran intelligence officer who had worked directly for Sir Francis Walsingham and was now working for the Queen's new spy master, Robert Cecil. Poley was a man who specialised in double-crossing. He had also been deeply involved in the Babington plot, gaining the trust of the Catholic conspirators before betraying them to the executioner. Poley was a man who lied for a living, and he was exceptionally good at it. According to the official coroner's report, which was only discovered in 1925 by the scholar Leslie Hodson, the 4 men arrived at Eleanor Bull's house at 10 o'clock in the morning. They spent the entire day together. They had lunch, walked in the garden, and then returned to their private room for supper. The coroner's report, based on the testimony of the 3 survivors, paints a very specific picture of what happened next. After supper, Fraser, Skeers, and Poley sat at a table playing backgammon. Marlowe, apparently not playing, was lying on a bed behind them. Then an argument broke out. The dispute, according to the survivors, was over le reckninge, the bill for the day's food and drink. The report claims that Marlowe, suddenly enraged, leapt up from the bed, drew his dagger, and attacked Ingram Fraser from behind. Because Fraser was sitting at the table, wedged between Skeers and Poley, he could not easily escape. Marlowe allegedly struck Fraser twice on the head with the dagger, inflicting 2 shallow cuts. Fraser, struggling for his life, managed to grab Marlowe's wrist. In the ensuing scuffle, Fraser forced the dagger back toward Marlowe. The blade entered Marlowe's head just above his right eye, piercing deep into his brain. According to the coroner, the wound was 2 inches deep and 1 inch wide. Christopher Marlowe died instantly. He was 29 years old. This is the official story. It is the story that the coroner, William Danby, accepted. It is the story that allowed Ingram Fraser to be pardoned just 4 weeks later, on the grounds that he had killed the playwright in self-defense. But for over 400 years, historians, scholars, and conspiracy theorists have looked at this official account and seen nothing but lies. The problems with the coroner's report are glaring. First, there is the physical implausibility of the struggle. If Fraser was trapped between 2 men at a table, with his back to his attacker, how did he manage to overpower a younger, presumably fitter man, turn the dagger around and drive it 2 inches into his skull with such precision and force? Second, there is the behavior of Scares and Poley. According to the report, these 2 hardened, violent men simply sat there and watched while their companion was attacked from behind, doing nothing to intervene until the fatal blow was struck. Third, and most suspiciously, there is the nature of the argument itself. Are we really to believe that 4 men, all connected to the highest levels of the Elizabethan government, spent 10 hours locked in a room together only to end up in a fatal brawl over who was going to pay for lunch? The timing of the murder is simply too convenient. Marlowe was a massive liability to the state. He was facing torture, and if he broke on the rack, he could have implicated some of the most powerful men in England, including Thomas Walsingham, the Earl of Northumberland, and perhaps even Sir Walter Raleigh, in atheism, treason, and illegal intelligence operations. By silencing Marlowe, the threat was neutralized. Many modern historians believe that the meeting at Deptford was an assassination. Whether it was ordered by the Privy Council, by Thomas Walsingham to protect himself, or by some other faction within the government, the result was a highly professional hit. Poley, Scares, and Fraser were not there to have a friendly lunch. They were there to solve a problem. The aftermath of the killing was swift and brutal. Because Marlowe had died a violent death, and because he was under suspicion of atheism, he was denied a proper Christian burial. On June 1st, 1593, just 2 days after his murder, his body was thrown into an unmarked plague pit in the churchyard of St. Nicholas in Deptford. There was no funeral, no monument, and no public mourning. The greatest poet of his generation was simply erased from the earth. The news of his death spread quickly through London, but it was met with a chilling silence from his fellow writers. In an age when poets routinely wrote elaborate elegies for their fallen colleagues, almost no one dared to publicly mourn Christopher Marlowe. He was too toxic, too dangerous to be associated with. The Puritan moralists, however, seized upon his death with glee. They saw the dagger in the eye as an act of divine retribution. The pamphleteer Thomas Beard wrote that Marlowe's death was a manifest sign of God's judgment, claiming that the playwright had died with a blasphemous oath on his lips. For decades, the official narrative remained unchallenged. Christopher Marlowe was a wicked, atheistic brawler who had met a fittingly violent end in a drunken tavern fight. But the truth, as we now know, was far more complex and far more tragic. Marlowe was not killed by a random act of violence. He was killed by the very system he had served. He had danced with the devil, both on the stage and in the shadow world of Elizabethan politics, and in the end, the devil had collected his due. The scholar, the spy, and the poet was dead, but the words he left behind were about to achieve an immortality that his murderers could never have imagined. The sudden, violent death of Christopher Marlowe in May 1593 sent shockwaves through the London literary world, but it was a shockwave muffled by fear. The circumstances of his death were so scandalous and his reputation so toxic that his fellow writers were largely terrified to speak his name in public. To openly mourn a man accused of atheism and treason was to invite the scrutiny of the Privy Council. And so, the greatest playwright of the Elizabethan age was buried in an unmarked grave in Deptford. But while the man was dead, his words were not. In the years immediately following his murder, Marlowe's works began to appear in print, ensuring that his voice would outlive his enemies. In 1594, just a year after his death, his masterpiece Edward II was published. It was followed by the publication of Dido, Queen of Carthage, and the first printed editions of Tamburlaine. In 1598, his unfinished, lushly erotic poem Hero and Leander was published, completed by his friend George Chapman. And in 1599, his translation of Ovid's Amores was printed, only to be immediately banned and publicly burned by the Archbishop of Canterbury for its explicit sexual content. Even from beyond the grave, Marlowe was still provoking the authorities. The publication of these works cemented Marlowe's reputation not just as a popular entertainer, but as a literary genius. His mighty line had permanently altered the DNA of English poetry and drama. But his most profound legacy was not to be found in the printing press. It was to be found in the work of the man who inherited his crown, William Shakespeare. When Marlowe died in 1593, Shakespeare was a relatively new, albeit promising, playwright on the London scene. He was exactly the same age as Marlowe. Both men were born in 1564, but Marlowe had achieved massive success much earlier. For the first few years of his career, Shakespeare was writing in the massive, intimidating shadow of Christopher Marlowe. The influence of Marlowe on Shakespeare is impossible to overstate. It is visible in almost everything Shakespeare wrote in the 1590s. When Shakespeare wrote Richard III, he was directly responding to the Machiavellian anti-hero template established by Tamburlaine and the Jew of Malta. When he wrote The Merchant of Venice, his character Shylock was a direct, complex response to Marlowe's Barabbas. And when he wrote Richard II, he was heavily influenced by the structure and political themes of Marlowe's Edward II. But Shakespeare did not just imitate Marlowe. He absorbed him, wrestled with him, and eventually surpassed him. And in one of his most famous plays, Shakespeare finally broke the silence surrounding his dead rival. In 1599, Shakespeare wrote the pastoral comedy As You Like It. In the play, the character Phoebe quotes a line of poetry. "Dead shepherd, now I find thy saw of might. Whoever loved that loved not at first sight." The saw of might is a direct quote from Marlowe's Hero and Leander. The dead shepherd is Christopher Marlowe himself. It is a touching, subtle tribute from one genius to another. But Shakespeare went even further. In the same play, the character Touchstone remarks, "When a man's verses cannot be understood, nor a man's good wit seconded with the forward child understanding, it strikes a man more dead than a great reckoning in a little room." A great reckoning in a little room. It is an unmistakable reference to the official story of Marlowe's death. The fatal argument over the reckoning in the small private room at Eleanor Bull's house in Deptford. Shakespeare, writing 6 years after the murder, was signalling to his audience that he knew exactly what had happened to his greatest rival. The theory, which first gained traction in the early 20th century, posits that Christopher Marlowe did not die in Deptford on May 30th, 1593. According to this theory, the murder was faked. Marlowe, facing imminent execution for atheism and treason, used his connections in the Secret Service to stage his own death. The body of another man, perhaps the unfortunate William Bradley, whom Marlowe had fought years earlier, or perhaps a plague victim, was presented to the coroner. Marlowe was then smuggled out of the country, perhaps to Italy or France, where he continued to write plays in secret. Because he was officially dead, he needed a frontman to present his new works to the London stage. He chose a moderately successful actor from Stratford-upon-Avon named William Shakespeare. Proponents of the Marlovian theory point to the incredible similarities in style, vocabulary, and thematic obsession between the two writers. They argue that the sudden explosion of Shakespeare's genius immediately following Marlowe's death is highly suspicious. They point to the fact that the first time the name William Shakespeare appeared in print as an author was just weeks after the Deptford murder, with the publication of the poem Venus and Adonis. Mainstream historians and literary scholars overwhelmingly reject the Marlowean theory. They point out that the stylistic similarities are simply the result of Shakespeare being heavily influenced by the dominant playwright of his era. They note that the coroner's report, discovered in 1925, provides a detailed, legally binding account of the death witnessed by 3 men. And they argue that the idea of a massive, state-sponsored cover-up, maintained flawlessly for decades, is simply too fantastical to be believed. But the persistence of the Marlowean theory speaks to something deeper than just a love of conspiracy. It speaks to the sheer, overwhelming power of Christopher Marlowe's talent. He was a writer of such explosive brilliance, such terrifying insight, that people simply cannot accept that his life was snuffed out at the age of 29 over a petty argument about a tavern bill. We want his story to have a grander, more theatrical ending. We want the master spy to have pulled off one final brilliant deception. As the 16th century drew to a close, the Elizabethan Golden Age was reaching its zenith. The theatres were packed, the poetry was flowing, and the English language was experiencing a renaissance unlike anything the world had ever seen. But none of it would have been possible without the cobbler's son from Canterbury. The scholar, the spy, the atheist, the brawler, the genius. Christopher Marlowe had lit the fuse, and the explosion was still echoing across the world. For nearly 2 centuries after his death, Christopher Marlowe was largely forgotten by the general public. The Puritans who closed the theatres in 1642 had no use for his blasphemous plays, and the refined neoclassical tastes of the 18th century found his thundering blank verse and extreme violence to be crude and barbaric. When he was remembered at all, it was usually as a cautionary tale. The wicked atheist who was struck down by God in a tavern brawl. His plays were rarely performed, and his poetry was overshadowed by the monumental, unassailable reputation of William Shakespeare. But true genius cannot be buried forever. In the early 19th century, the Romantic poets, men who, like Marlowe, valued rebellion, intense emotion, and the defiance of authority, rediscovered him. Writers like Charles Lamb, William Hazlitt, and Percy Shelley recognized in Marlowe a kindred spirit. They saw past the moralistic condemnation of the Elizabethan authorities and recognized the sheer, terrifying beauty of his poetry. They championed his work, bringing Dr. Faustus and Edward II back into the literary conversation. The Victorian poet Algernon Charles Swinburne would later write of Marlowe, "He is the greatest discoverer, the most daring and inspired pioneer in all our poetic literature. Before him, there was neither genuine blank verse nor a genuine tragedy in our language." This 19th century revival rescued Marlowe from obscurity, but it was the 20th century that truly resurrected him as a cultural icon. In 1925, the American scholar Leslie Hodgson made one of the most spectacular literary discoveries of the modern era. While digging through the dusty archives of the Public Record Office in London, Hodgson uncovered the original coroner's report detailing the inquest into Marlowe's death. For the first time in over 300 years, the world knew the names of the men who were in the room with Marlowe: Ingram Fraser, Nicholas Skeers, and Robert Poley. Hodgson's discovery changed everything. It proved that Marlowe had not died in a random tavern brawl over a prostitute, as centuries of moralizing gossip had claimed. It revealed that he had died in the company of professional spies, con men, and government agents. Suddenly, the story of Christopher Marlowe was no longer just a literary tragedy. It was a political thriller. This revelation sparked a massive resurgence of interest in Marlowe's life and work. Scholars began to comb through the Elizabethan state papers, uncovering the extent of his involvement with Sir Francis Walsingham's Secret Service. The image of Marlowe shifted from that of a drunken brawler to that of a brilliant, dangerous intelligence operative, a Renaissance James Bond who wrote poetry of unparalleled beauty. In the theatre, Marlowe's plays experienced a massive revival. Directors and actors realized that his works were not just historical curiosities, but vital, urgent dramas that spoke directly to the anxieties of the modern world. Dr. Faustus, with its themes of overreaching ambition and the terrifying consequences of forbidden knowledge, resonated deeply in the atomic age. The Jew of Malta, with its cynical depiction of religious hypocrisy and political corruption, felt shockingly modern. And Edward II was recognized as a groundbreaking exploration of sexuality and power, becoming a staple of the theatrical repertoire. In 1943, the playwright and director Tyrone Guthrie staged a legendary production of Tamburlaine at the Old Vic in London, starring Donald Wolfett. It was the first major professional production of the play in over 300 years. And it proved that Marlowe's mighty line still possessed the power to electrify an audience. His influence is everywhere. You can hear the echoes of his blank verse in the poetry of John Milton and John Keats. You can see the shadow of his Machiavellian anti-heroes in modern cinema and television, from Michael Corleone in The Godfather to Walter White in Breaking Bad. Every time a writer creates a character who is brilliant, ruthless, and tragically flawed, they are walking in the footsteps of Christopher Marlowe.